Hey y'all, welcome to Chapter 7, Developed Democracies. We're going to have fun learning more about developed democracies together. This will be a new experience for all of us, first time I've recorded a lecture, so hopefully you guys will enjoy this. Alright, so what is a developed democracy? We're going to look at some countries that aren't developed democracies in this course, and we're going to look at plenty that are. But a developed democracy is typically considered to be one that has high levels of democratic institutions that have been around for a long time. It's one that is modernized, and so you're going to see in a developed democracy that a developed economy goes along with that citizens are prosperous. The countries that we're referring to as developed democracies for this course were those that were called First World during the Cold War. So during the Cold War, you had First World, which is considered to be the capitalist democracies that were developed. And you had Second World, which was considered to be the communist countries. And then Third World were what we today refer to as developing nations. So when we talk about developed democracies, we're talking about those that used to be referred to as First World, but that term is outdated and not as helpful. All right, had some technical difficulties since this is the first time I've done this, but hopefully this resaves correctly. Okay, so developed democracies are all going to be capitalist systems. So they're going to use the market system. These will be what we also know as market economies, whereby the forces of supply and demand are supposed to balance out against each other, and you'll come to an equilibrium whereby it's best for the consumer and for the supplier. These economies can be truly liberal. Think of the United States or the UK. They can be social democratic. Think of Sweden, France, Germany, or mercantilist, which really the only developed democracy that you're going to see that in is Japan. In developed democracies, they're post-industrial. So they've moved from that industrialization to a post-industrialization service economy. The United States is like this. You'll note that most of the jobs are in service. I could list what that means, but I think that you guys should think of that on your own as good review for the types of jobs that dominate in the United States. Okay, and then high human development index rankings for developed democracies. If you don't remember what HDI means, go and review. Good time to break out those notes, do some review. And then in developed democracies, again, they'll answer those questions about freedom and equality slightly in slightly different ways. Think of Sweden, that has more of an emphasis on equality, versus the United States, that has more of an emphasis on individual freedom. But they'll all highly value freedom and equality in different ways, but those are definitely values that they share. So you can take a look at what each area of the economy contributes to developed democracies. So you'll note the United States, we have passed through the agricultural phase, we've passed through the industrial phase, and now we're dominated by services. And you'll note that Germany and Poland, EU nations, also fall under this, whereas Nigeria, which we'll study later in the year, still has a lot of its GDP coming from agriculture and industry. So they are not a post-industrialized nation, really not even yet an industrialized nation in many ways. And again, we'll study more of that when we get to Nigeria later. Okay, so when you're looking at a developed democracy, as we talked about before with democracies, that democracies are defined by participation, competition, and liberty, but they're going to solve those questions in different ways. So in some nations, they will have referendums and initiatives at the national level, and in some they're local. For example, the United States, no national referendum or initiative. But in other countries, you can have a national referendum or initiative. In countries like the UK, they held a referendum on whether or not they should remain part of the EU, but typically acts of parliament, which Brexit was not, acts of parliament are not going to be subject to referendum because the idea of parliament as sovereign. Voting rules will be different. Who can participate and how in each country. Voting ages vary widely. For example, in Iran, you can vote at 15. Hey, you guys could all vote. What do you think about that? Should we let 15-year-olds vote? I'll let you guys think about that one. Competition will be demonstrated in the types of executive systems that they have. So are they going to have a parliamentary democracy? Are they going to have a presidential one? Is it going to be a hybrid system or that semi-presidential democracy? How will campaigns be funded? You'll note that in the United States, large amounts of money is able to be poured into elections. And I want you guys to go back and review why that is, what court decisions led to that, what acts of Congress or act of Congress tried to prevent that, why was that changed. So go back and look at those funding rules and then what was created when those were changed in the Supreme Court cases. Other countries limit the amount of time you can campaign and how much money can actually be spent on those campaigns. And then different countries will emphasize different rights and freedoms that citizens have. And so in some countries, they will protect freedom of speech and freedom of the press more highly than in others. For example, in the United States, both those things are protected at a high level. Whereas if you go even to the UK, you won't enjoy necessarily the same freedoms that you do here. Abortion is treated differently in different countries. Healthcare is treated as a right in some places and not in others. So think about in the United States that we don't consider healthcare necessarily to be a right, whereas in Britain it is, and they provide for it with a national health service. And then courts have different powers. In Britain, there's no constitutional court, again, because Parliament is sovereign. Whereas if you think about the United States, our Supreme Court does have the right of judicial review, and so they will rule on whether citizens' rights have been compromised if acts of Congress, not Parliament, we don't have one of those, acts of Congress have violated the Constitution and thereby violated citizen rights. So democracies are very diverse and they look at things very differently. All right, here's a nice little cartoon for you guys to interpret so you can look at those. In terms of developed democracies and how they deal with economics, because politics and economics intersect. Developed democracies will all value private property and will all value free markets. However, where they differ is going to be on social welfare spending. How big and how generous is the social safety net? So in the United States, I'm going to refer back to this. Remember, don't you guys use this as a comparative thing, but I will to help you all review for the U.S. exam. In the United States, we don't necessarily think that there should be big social safety nets. And again, it depends on if you're a Republican or Democrat. Think about how your political party affects your beliefs on that. Whereas in other countries, they do believe that there should be a big and generous social welfare net, and so they spend a lot of tax money on that. So tax burdens go along with that idea behind social welfare spending. So higher tax burdens are associated with a more generous social safety net, and lower taxes than typically with a lower. And so if you look at the United States tax burden relative to other countries, it's a lot lower, and thus the safety net is correspondingly lower. And then depending on how much of a market system the developed democracy devotes itself to, you may have more relaxed employment protections for people, really letting those market forces drive employment and how workers can be fired. So in countries that have stronger unions and unions that are more involved in making government decisions, think about what type of system that is, corporatist or pluralism, then you'll get stronger protections for workers. All right, for the question, we'll discuss this in class, so I'll leave that here for you to think about how you'd answer when we get to class. moving through time, we see some countries democratizing, and you guys read the paper, so you know that democratization has come in waves over time. And then with democratization, we're starting to see movements towards almost, not really necessarily erasing state boundaries, but to some extent with the European Union. So state sovereignty is taking some hits, and we talked about, well, the state is currently the political form that we have for countries, but that could change. It hasn't been the way that people have organized their governments necessarily throughout history, so it could change. And we're looking at some of these things. So there can be international pressures. Think about international organizations that the United States belongs to. You've thought? Can you name? You said the UN or the WTO, World Trade Organization, right? Those would be two different international organizations the United States belongs to. They have their own rules and regulations that can reduce state sovereignty because they reduce the state ability to act, to manage their own affairs, because they've sort of ceded judgment to these other organizations. Devolution then is a force within a nation versus without, with the international integration. Devolution is when the central government's going to give more power to the local and regional levels. So again, this is going to reduce the state capacity and state autonomy. They're more dependent then on the local and regional actors. We saw this in the United States with Republicans returning more funding decisions to the states, so giving them block grants for welfare reform in the 1990s, and that led to states being able to experiment with how they're going to distribute welfare benefits. So that makes the federal government then more reliant on state governments. And here you can see membership in the European Union. So this is a supranational organization that has led to decreased autonomy for its member states. And Britain, of course, was part of the European Union and currently still is, but is negotiating its exit. In 2015, they voted to leave. So they didn't like that their autonomy had been taken away so much that their laws were subject to review by the European Union Court of Justice. So they voted to leave. Take a look at a minute really quickly here at how the European Union got to be. I'm assuming that the comparative exam is going to change either the country, so maybe we won't study Great Britain anymore, or we'll de-emphasize the EU since Britain isn't part of the EU. Well, it won't be in another year or so here. So the European Union was really this almost idealistic union at the begining. Europe suffered through two devastating wars, and at the end of it, people kind of looked around and went, what are we doing? You know, this is not healthy. This is not helpful. And so they said, well, these wars come from us always being in competition with each other. What if we joined together and stopped fighting each other? So it originally begins as a small economic unit. They had the European Coal and Steel Community. And this was just to facilitate trade on coal and steel. And as time goes along, more countries join and they begin to integrate in bigger ways until finally the Maastricht Treaty is signed in the 1990s to bring the European Union into existence. In 2002, they begin to use the euro, and that is still in use, although Britain never joined the currency union. Several actually member EU states never joined the currency union. They still retain their own currencies. Then in 2004, the EU Constitution was voted on, but France and the Netherlands failed to ratify that, so awkward. In 2009, then you get the Lisbon Treaty, and that too had trouble with some of the member states, but there you get the EU president, and then expanded powers for the European Union Commission, the European Union Parliament, and the Court of Justice. So there are several institutions you should be familiar with in terms of the EU. The European Council, and this is sort of the executive of the European Union. It's made up of the heads of government of all the member EU states. And so it meets only twice a year because obviously they got to be in their own country governing. And so they're the ones that sort of set the direction of EU legislation for the year, but other branches will take up the legislation. It's not going to make those decisions. Then you have the European Commission. So this combines sort of the executive with the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy. I know you don't miss bureaucracy. But hey, at least we got to watch a fun little Futurama clip on bureaucracy. So the European Commission is the one that's going to initiate proposals to apply to the whole EU. And so they're going to draft legislation for the EU. They're going to oversee all the agencies of the EU, and they're going to make sure that member states are following EU treaties that have been signed. So the European Commission is 28 cabinet ministers plus the president of the Commission. And the president is chosen by the council and then approved by the parliament. So there's some sort of check and balance that's happening there. The commission members get to be on the council because they're appointed by their home governments. So they're not directly elected by the people of Europe, of the member states of the European Union. If a member state is not following the EU laws, then they can be referred by the Commission to the Court of Justice. Ooh, they're gonna get punished. Well, maybe not. Maybe they'll just get like a timeout, which is like mild punishment. Just kidding. I don't know what a country timeout would look like, but I figured you guys probably were tired of listening to me talk for a little bit, so I'll try to make you laugh. All right, here we go. We're still doing the EU. We're almost halfway there. So you have two legislatures, the Council of Ministers, and then the European Parliament. Hey, the EU people finally get to, EU citizens, finally get to elect somebody. Woohoo! The European Parliament is made up of representatives from all member states. And I lost my train of thought. Sorry, guys. Members of all... And the representation is proportional to the population of the member country. And the EU is a bicameral legislature. Well, yeah. And then we also have the European Court of Justice. Sorry. Lost my train of thought again. Okay. So the European Court of Justice can rule on laws within EU member states. And this is what really got Britain upset. They felt that they'd ceded sovereignty to this court. And they're like, oh, heck no. We're out of here. So that was kind of one of the sticking points, is that to be in the EU, you basically do give up state sovereignty, and not everybody's really happy with that. All right. So why go to a common currency? There were several hopes here. One is that it would bind countries more closely together, that it would increase Europe's standing in the world, because it's important to have your currency be a reserve currency. The United States dollar is a reserve currency, which means that central banks keep it on hand. It's seen as a safe investment. So the euro, the Europeans were really hoping that the euro would also do this. And then that would help with trade and investment between member states. And so out of all of those hopes, what really worked was that it became a reserve currency. So that was great. But what was not great is that member states the economies were growing at different rates. So, for example, Greece had a huge economic crisis that was precipitated somewhat as a result of the housing crisis and the global recession of 2008. and they couldn't get out of it in ways that nations would usually do by letting their currency devalue. Um, and they were stuck. And so other member states had to bail out Greece and lend them money, and this has caused all kinds of resentment. So the Germans kind of feel like, hey, we're always bailing out these slacker countries. So it's almost kind of like what you hear about politicians in the United States in terms of talking about different groups of citizens, except this was countries throwing shade at each other. So that was fun. Okay. The European Union was also seeking to constantly expand. And the hope was that in expansion, they would then spread democracy to areas of Europe that were under communist regimes, would help with expanding democracy into areas like Turkey, that this would help countries that had been under communism transition more fully to market economies. And that through this, then the EU would increase in power and prestige because they'd have access to these strong markets that were in countries that were all politically aligned in terms of supporting democratic ideals, and then that this would cover a large population. And so they were hoping that this would all be part of their spread. And you can click back in the slideshow if you need to and look at that map, or look back in your packet that I gave you guys at that map of how the European Union was growing. So in a certain sense, this worked. So there was some growth in terms of markets. There was some reform in various countries. But immigration has been a real sticking point as citizens of certain nations have been resentful of people coming in from other nations and, quote unquote, stealing their jobs. You can't see my air quotes in my fingers, but I was doing that, and so my husband's sitting over here laughing at me right now. And so they didn't appreciate that. Turkey is a real problem. So the EU negotiated a deal with Turkey for people who had fled from Syria and other migrants that had come to the EU, that they would be returned through Turkey, and Turkey would get kind of fast-tracked for becoming a member state of the EU. Well, lo and behold, the leader of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, basically is turning himself into a dictator, and Turkey is very rapidly becoming non-democratic. So I don't know how that's going to work, because the European Constitution says that member states have to be democratic. And so I don't know what they're going to do with Turkey now, because they made this deal, and it doesn't look so great now. We talked about devolution a bit already, and we'll study it more fully when we look at the UK. So they have created parliaments in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland that have more power to deal with things like how tax dollars are spent and education in those areas. Scotland has more than Wales or Northern Ireland because they held the independence referendum, and so the central government of the UK promised them more autonomy if they were to remain in the UK, and that's what happened. So, why devolve power? There's a couple of reasons. One is that local governments sometimes are more trusted than the central government. So if you're dealing with trust issues, then devolution could be a great way to get citizens to re-engage with the government and sort of regain their trust. Devolution also offers more ability for minorities within a country to have their voice heard. They may be concentrated in certain areas where power is devolved, and so then they are able to have more say in how their tax dollars are spent and get more the ear of the government to pay attention to them. And this also then, the hope is that this fosters more engagement from citizens because they feel that their voices are being heard. However, people who don't like devolution say that, look, what this really does is impair the central government from carrying out its functions. It can't provide services as readily because it has to consider these local and regional concerns, and that then undermines what they're able to do. This could also lead to ethnicities wanting more autonomy, and they could say, like, well, this region got devolved powers and this people group did, so why don't we? You'll see this in Spain. This has been pretty intense in Spain in the last year. The Basque people were given more autonomy, which led to the Catalans wanting more autonomy, and that led to this whole showdown over Catalonia declaring independence this past fall, and that's still an ongoing crisis in Spain. So, developed democracies used to be a little bit more homogenous, excluding the United States, which obviously has always had very high levels of immigration. But other developed democracies have not. And so immigration can destabilize some developed democracies as they try to handle large amounts of immigrants coming into the country. So we're seeing sort of a backlash to immigration all around the world right now. This isn't exclusive to the United States. This has been occurring in all places right now. In all developed democracies, there's been sort of this backlash. And it's suspected that Putin has purposely been destabilizing Syria in order to send waves of refugees into Europe in order to destabilize European democracies, so that he's really trying to play the hand that he has, because Russia is just simply not a really formidable nation right now. So they're exploiting what they do have to maintain their position as a power player on the global stage.